Hello, buenos dias. Willie Logan here at Parque Tomás Garrido in Villahermosa, Tabasco. I'm going to tell you the story of Garridismo. Garridismo is named after Tomás Garrido Canabal, who is honored by this larger-than-life statue behind me. Tomás Garrido was the governor of Tabasco during the Mexican Revolution 100 years ago. He was a great modernizer. He built highways and strung telegraph lines and built airstrips all over the state. But that is not what Garridismo is about. Garridismo refers to the forceful suppression of religion, particularly Catholicism, in Garrido's Tabasco. Suppressing religion went part and parcel with creating a modern Tabasco. Tomás Garrido believed that in order to modernize his state, he had to do away with superstition and fanaticism as he saw it, which to him was represented by Catholicism. To that end, Garrido expelled priests from the state, and his followers burned images of saints and tore down churches. The Mexican Revolution was a period of great upheaval and bloodshed. And while the violence was worse in other parts of Mexico, nowhere was the anti-Catholicism more extreme than right here in Tabasco. This is the story of how Garridismo tried and failed to destroy Catholicism in Tabasco.
The Mexican Revolution began on November 20, 1910, when Francisco I. Madero called for the people of Mexico to rise up in rebellion against President of the Mexican Republic, Porfirio Diaz. Don Porfirio had been president of Mexico almost continuously for the past 40 years. During that time, Mexico had industrialized and its economy had grown, but only a small percentage of the Mexican population was able to enjoy the benefits of this development. When Madero called for revolution, he touched a nerve for a large portion of the Mexican population. In short order, Don Porfirio had been deposed and sent into exile in France, and Madero had been elected the first revolutionary president of Mexico. Madero's ouster of Diaz was merely the beginning of the first phase of the Mexican Revolution, the armed conflict phase, which lasted from 1910 until 1920. It was really a civil war within Mexico, and an exceptionally violent one at that. Well over 1 million people were killed in the revolution, or about 10% of the Mexican population. The winners of the armed phase of the revolution were the Constitutionalists. They gave Mexico its third constitution, the 1917 Constitution, which is still in effect. Under the previous constitution, which was written in 1857, Mexico had experienced economic development for the benefit of the few and at the expense of everyone else. The 1917 Constitution was designed to prevent that from happening again. It was supposed to promote better conditions for the masses, not just the elites. But the armed phase was only the first part of the upheaval of the Mexican Revolution. The second phase was the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1920 and lasted until about 1940. While it maybe wasn't as dramatic as the armed phase, it had just as far-reaching consequences, one of which was the revolutionary elite's embrace of anti-clericalism, or opposition to priests and the priesthood. The 1917 Mexican Constitution had several anti-clerical provisions, but how they were enforced depended on who was in charge at the federal and the state level. At the federal level, the biggest champion of anti-clericalism was Plutarco Elias Calles, who served as president from 1924 to 1928. He secularized primary education, deported foreign-born church officials, and instructed states to begin registering and regulating clergy. He also covertly supported a schismatic church, the Iglesia Católica Apostólica Mexicana, which was supposed to be led by a revolutionary patriarch. But the schismatic church failed to catch on, and Calles' religious persecutions angered Catholic peasants, leading to the outbreak of the bloody Cristero War in 1926. In 1928, at the end of Calles' term, Álvaro Obregón was elected to be the next president of Mexico. But before he could take office, Obregón was assassinated by a Catholic radical. Instead, Emilio Portes Gil was appointed provisional president. Portes Gil ended the Cristero War by reaching an agreement with the rebels. But far from being soft on religion, he also enforced the anti-clerical Article 130 of the 1917 Constitution, which outlawed religious education and public worship. As a result of this and other laws, many priests were fined and jailed. Some were beaten, even to death. Individual believers were also harassed and fined, or forced to do heavy labor without pay. By 1935, there were only 305 legally registered priests in all of Mexico. This was national-level policy, but the governors of the states approached enforcement in their own ways. Some merely locked their churches and left it at that. Others took a harder-line approach to anti-clericalism, expelling priests altogether and demolishing the odd church. Then there was Tabasco, the domain of Tomás Garrido Canabal, where anti-clericalism was taken to its extreme.
There are two ways that you can remember Tomás Garrido. One of them is as a visionary modernizer, which is how he's portrayed in this statue. The other is as a persecutor of Catholicism and an all-around villain. Both are true in their own way, and they aren't self-contradictory. Tomás Garrido was a revolutionary elite who wanted to forge a new society in Tabasco, and in order to do that, he felt that he had to do away with Catholicism, the superstition of the common people.
Tomás Garrido was from a large landholding family, and his reforms turned Tabasco into a giant banana plantation, with him as the hacendado, which means planter or landlord. True to his class, he did not include land reform in his revolution. He was paternalistic in his relationship to labor. His banning Catholicism in Tabasco made workers easier to control. He also banned alcohol, to the same effect.
To be fair, Garrido did enact some reforms that improved the lives of workers. He raised wages, enacted a minimum wage, reduced working hours, and launched a vaccination program. He even tried to abolish child labor.
Other reforms related to the infrastructural and economic development of Tabasco. His government built highways, strung telephone and telegraph wires, installed electrical plants in villages, and constructed airstrips across the state. Garrido flew around Tabasco in a plane named El Guacamayo, which means the macaw. It was a Stinson SR Reliant built in Michigan.
The other side of Garrido's attempted modernization of Tabasco was his efforts to suppress Catholicism in the state. Under new laws, priests were forced to marry or be expelled from the state. In carefully orchestrated campaigns, mobs attacked churches, dragging images of saints outside and burning them. On one day in December 1931, 2,000 images of saints were burned in the Tabascan town of Jalpa. Church buildings were even demolished by mobs, up to and including the cathedral in Villahermosa.
In Garrido's Tabasco, as well as across revolutionary Mexico, teachers were on the front line of the de-Christianization campaigns. Teachers were responsible for inculcating the youth with the modern ideals of the revolution. For example, teachers often led the saint-burning campaigns. But only teachers who held the proper ideology were allowed to continue in their work. In many states, including Tabasco, teachers had to sign a pledge affirming that they were atheists and anti-Catholic. If they refused to sign, they were fired from their jobs.
Garrido went so far as to ban anything that had to do with religion. He banned the use of crosses in cemeteries. He banned the use of the word Dios, which is the Spanish word for God. He even banned the use of the word adios, which is how you say goodbye in Spanish, because it contains the word Dios. Instead, people in Garrido's Tabasco were taught to say adieu, not the French word adieu, but a made-up word spelled A-D-I-U. Garrido knew that something had to take the place of religious festivals and the veneration of saints in people's lives, and he supplied the replacement. In place of religious festivals, he invented new secular festivals, like the Fiesta of the Banana Flower. And instead of venerating saints, people in Garridos, Tabasco paid homage to national heroes. Above all, Benito Juarez, president of Mexico during the French intervention in the 1860s.
In 1938, British Catholic author Greene traveled to Mexico to investigate the results of the religious persecutions there, not just in Tabasco, but across the country. The worst of the persecution was past at this point. Calles and Garrido had both lost power and gone into exile. But the results of the persecutions were apparent everywhere, especially in Tabasco. Greene wrote 2 books based on his experience in Mexico. The better known of them is a novel, The Power and the Glory. It's about an imaginary last priest working in Garridos, Tabasco, when all the other priests have been forced to marry, expelled from the state, or shot. The priest has a very human weakness for liquor, which, like his priestly work, is also outlawed in Garridos, Tabasco. But even though he is a clearly flawed person, he is called to a higher purpose. The Power and the Glory is a beautiful and deeply moving book. It filled me when I read it. The other book that Greene wrote after his trip to Mexico was The Lawless Roads, a non-fiction travelogue. The book narrates Greene's entire trip, from crossing into northern Mexico at Laredo, through Mexico City and Veracruz, an excursion to Tabasco and the Mayan ruins of Palenque, and a visit to San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas, before catching a ship back to Europe from Veracruz. The section about Tabasco is especially interesting, as it includes plenty of details that made it into the novel. My favorite detail is that the site where the cathedral had stood in Villahermosa was now occupied by a playground, but the metal play equipment was too hot to use in the tropical sun.
While The Lawless Roads has some interesting parts, it's honestly pretty disappointing in comparison with The Power and the Glory. It's clear from reading this travelogue that Greene hated most of his trip to Mexico. He seemed to be having travel fatigue for most or all of the trip, and he even goes so far as complaining about the food in Mexico. Are we talking about the same country here? More disappointingly, Greene clearly held the same racial and ethnic prejudices that many people of his race, ethnicity, and class held during the 1930s. He complains repeatedly about the dumb brown eyes of Mexicans that he encounters, and he expresses great excitement whenever he encounters a blonde girl. This is not really that surprising considering when Greene lived and when he was writing, but still it's disappointing. I would have expected him to be more empathetic toward people who are different from him, judging from The Power and the Glory.
The Mexican Revolution's experiment with de-Christianization came to an end after Lázaro Cárdenas became president in 1934. Although no friend of religion, Cárdenas rolled back the enforcement of the anti-religious laws, while keeping them on the books. Cárdenas explained his rationale in this way. "I am sick of closing churches only to reopen them," he said. "I shall now open them all, and in 10 years, religion will have disappeared." He was wrong, of course. Cárdenas, like many other members of the revolutionary elite, failed to appreciate just how much religion meant to the common people of Mexico. After the de facto end of persecution, things started to go back to normal across the country. Services resumed, and priests went back to taking confessions. The anti-religious laws were finally officially rescinded in 1992.
In Tabasco, Tomás Garrido fell from power and went into exile in Costa Rica. Things slowly returned to normal here as well. The Cathedral of Villahermosa, which was demolished by a mob, was finally rebuilt in 1970. From the front, the cathedral looks as impressive as it always did, with a fancy Baroque facade and towers. But the nave, where the congregation sits during services, is truncated. Catholicism is alive and well in Tabasco, as is Protestantism, but things could never quite be the same after Garridismo. Well, that's the story of Garridismo in Tabasco. On a future visit to this state, I'd like to make a video about the multiple times Tabasco has been invaded and the invasions have been repelled between the 16th and the 19th centuries. But that's all the video making I have time for on this trip. And anyway, it's going to be something like 110 degrees later today, so I should probably go inside and stop shooting videos out here. Thanks for watching my video. I'll see you in the next one. Adieu.